Hi, this is Lori Harrison, and as you can see in this segment, we're going to be discussing assessment in online environments. Now, you may have a few questions about this. You may be considering how assessment fits into the process of constructive alignment, which we've been talking about. You may be wondering how you can use assessment to support the learning process, not just evaluate what learners have learned at the end, but support their learning process through the duration of your course. And you may also be wondering how to efficiently and effectively provide learners with feedback. Before we go further, let's just do a quick recap on constructive alignment. You'll recall that it is a cycle or process, and our aim is to align learning outcomes with the types of assessments, feedback, and activities that we plan. We want to make sure that those assessments match up with learning outcomes. If you recall backwards design, we think about what we want students to demonstrate at the end of the course, and then we work backwards from that to determine what teaching and learning activities we're going to need to support them in successful achievement of those assessments. To start this unit, we shared with you a video that had a number of leading educators discussing their ideas about the place of assessment in course design, and we hope you found that fruitful. We thought it provided some interesting food for thought. Based on the video you watched and what you know about constructive alignment, you may be thinking a bit differently about the purposes of assessment. There are two main types of assessment, and these ideas were reflected in the comments of those interviewed. They essentially are known as formative assessment and summative assessment. To elaborate on that, you could think of formative assessment as assessment for learning. Formative assessment encourages learning during the assessment process, whereas summative assessment tends to occur at the conclusion and has the role of auditing whether or not at the end of the course students have achieved those outcomes. So let's talk a little bit more about the differences between these two types and how you might use them in your courses. Formative assessment helps students to understand how their learning is progressing during the course. So as they're going along, they're getting regular feedback. Usually it's less formal, and generally it focuses attention on what the most important aspects of the subject are. So it flags for the students what they should be thinking about. What are the key elements of the learning outcomes that are going to be essential to their success? It gives them a chance to practice their skills and consolidate their learning, and importantly, it helps them to think about what they need to know about what they still need to learn in order to succeed. So it gives them some idea of what they do know, but also what they still need to work on. Typically, it involves regular feedback through the course. The feedback is ideally frequent and immediate. Sometimes it involves self-assessment. That's fine. A student can compare their work against particular criteria or reflect on their progress. And in that way, it often clarifies criteria for success if you're giving them an outline for self-assessment or for assessment of their peers. Typically, it's forward-looking. It's helping them to think about what they still need to learn and how they need to improve their skills to succeed in the course. Sometimes formative assessment is also called educative assessment. That's another term that you may hear. Again, this is assessment for learning, assessment that supports them during the process. On the other hand, we have the idea of summative assessment, which is perhaps more typical, and this is the situation where you're evaluating your students after you finish teaching a particular unit or module or course. So this, in a way, is looking at achievement to count towards their grade in a manner that's backward looking to see if at the end of a particular unit you see that the students have achieved the outcomes that you were seeking. So it uses summative information, usually for grading purposes. If we think about the characteristics, there's typically less feedback going back to the student to inform their learning during the process. there is typically more of a backward-looking approach where you are looking at an auditive grading process. If we compare the types of activities that we could use for educative and auditive or formative and summative assessments, some examples for formative would be weekly observations or reflections, perhaps submitting an outline for a project, mid-course feedback, peer feedback, or discussing and sharing ideas with the class within the course, perhaps in a discussion forum. On the other hand, summative evaluations could include midterm assessments, final group projects, perhaps a capstone project or a final essay, or perhaps submitting analysis of the case study. While we're speaking about assessment, we should also recall some of the characteristics of authentic assessment. You'll remember we talked about this previously, where ensuring that the assessment is realistic, ensuring that it links back to something that is relevant in their workplace, perhaps challenges they face in their community life, requiring their judgment or perhaps their innovation for solutions. In summary, if something is an authentic assessment, it assesses students' ability to access a repertoire of knowledge and to demonstrate their skills in negotiating a complex task. So we need to think about how they're integrating the knowledge that they have access to and the skills they're gaining to achieve that outcome. A few more assessment ideas. You could consider self-performance review, have students evaluate their own performance, case study analysis, blog posts, perhaps a scaffolded project either as an individual or as a group that moves them through a series of steps and a process. They could do self-testing on a particular reading or particular materials to ensure that they had comprehension of the materials. They could co-create materials in a website or wiki together or as individuals, create videos, perhaps assemble a learning portfolio, participate in discussions in the discussion forum in the course, perhaps provide an annotated bibliography as part of a larger project, follow a journal about a news or policy issue, or perhaps a final capstone project that pulls it all together. Some key ideas here are that we aim to provide students with effective feedback that's timely and focused on specific actions, knowledge, or skills that are part of the learning outcomes we're looking for. You can use students to provide formative feedback to one another from peer to peer that builds community and also provides them with immediate and helpful feedback. In this context, grading rubrics can help with grading time, less time marking, consistency of the feedback, and also the effectiveness of the feedback that you give to your students. So what is a rubric anyway? Let's just delve into that for a moment. A rubric is a tool that provides students with detailed explanations about what aspects of an assignment are being assessed. What defines an A, a B, or a C, or good, better, and best. And they're particularly useful for self-assessment or peer assessment, although they can be also used for any assessment for your own grading. There's a little image here. A rubric typically takes the form of a table, and in the first column are noted the characteristics of the portion of the assessment criteria, and then in each column a grade level, and then in the cell a more specific description of what characterizes an A or a B or a C across different dimensions of the assignment criteria. So you may want to use those both for yourself and for your students. They certainly clarify what your expectations are and help students to understand what kind of learning is expected of them. In summary, to wrap up, we've discussed in this segment that assessment continues to be important as part of the constructive alignment process as we check for learning outcomes and make sure they're aligned with the original learning outcomes that we set out. Secondly, we can consider whether we need to include both summative and formative assessment in our course designs. And thirdly, think about whether self-assessment and peer evaluation can be used to increase student interaction with content and with each other. Now, with this video complete, it's time for your next activity. Please move on to our next offering, which is an opportunity for you to browse for ideas in our showcase of online assessment strategies.